Welcome, tape shaggers. In this video I'm going to disassemble this muckle beast, the Akai MG614. I haven't taken one of these apart before. A lot of my videos tearing down multitrack cassette recorders feature models where I have significant experience in deconstructing the unit, and as such they represent a good guide on best practices. Anything I do in this video you should take with a pinch of salt, since I will be taking it apart for the first time, but hopefully a lot of my experience in disassembling, repairing and reassembling machines like this is going to be transferable to this unit, and so I will roll the introduction and then we'll start taking this to bits. If you're new to the channel or new to taking these things apart, here's a couple of tips about what to do. I'm going to have this video footage as reference, but you might want to take photos as you take something apart. Once you get inside the unit, it's usually possible to write on surfaces with an HB pencil, or you can use a Sharpie like this. You'd be able to wipe away anything you wrote using an isopropyl pad or something like that. It's useful to have a bunch of old ice cream containers or jars, or preferably a multi-compartment plastic box, so you can put the components into compartments from left to right or top to bottom in the order that you remove them. That way, when you reassemble the unit, you can just put stuff back in the reverse order. You can also put coloured marker on masking tape around the ends of cables that you disconnect. Give yourself a better idea of where to put them back. Presumably you're going to see me use some of those techniques as I take this apart. I'm going to begin by using this spudging tool. This is something that you would normally use to remove upholstery from a car, to get any of these knobs off that I can before I start to unscrew anything. We'll quickly note where the different colours go. We've got red for the gain trims, sort of beige for the parametric EQ, and all the other knobs seem to be pale grey. These three bus faders are blue, the other ones are red. When we come back I'll have removed these. So you can see that all the knobs are off in different bags to keep myself organised. Also, the plastic cover for this mechanical door isn't quite on straight. I'm going to wait until I can see the mechanism better to try and put that on properly. So we will investigate how to remove that later in the video. So the first thing I'm going to try and do is remove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws from this end and the corresponding 6 from the other, and see how much access that gives us. Although the heads of those screws looked identical, the ones in these positions where my fingers are shorter, and the ones in these 8 positions are much longer, like so. Removing the screws allows this plastic part to come away, and underneath we have a plate here. That plate must have been sat like that, so that this peg where I'm tapping would go into that hole there. It looks as though with both ends removed we would be able to proceed and remove some of these screws in the bottom and take this bottom plate off. From this bottom board I've removed 9 screws. The positions are here: 1, 2, 3 this row, 4, 5, 6 this row, 7, 8, 9 this row. This is what those screws look like. Dome top, maybe about 1 centimetre long, narrow ferrule. To remove the plate I'm tipping from this end and pulling forward. For reassembly purposes this would need to go in first, because this little lip slides under here when you put it back on, so that's got to go in that way. Notice when I've got it that way down, there's actually a cushion underneath there, and that's just to prevent the weight of this thing, which is significant, bending any of the faders or so on. And all this is corrosion. This has clearly been stored somewhere damp for some time. On plates like this it's probably not going to matter. My concern is though that this kind of corrosion extends onto the cassette player and so on. I've removed another 7 of the same type of screws that you just saw from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 holes here. It looks like there should be some kind of screw coming from the other side of this PCB to there, but it was missing on this one in any case. The corrosion had got to the space between the holes in this plate, so I had to use quite a viscous motor oil and then hit the end of the screwdriver with a mallet to get these to turn. It looks like removing this is not strictly necessary. I was wanting to access the cassette player here, but by the looks of things I need to get at it from the front, not the back. So I suppose under most circumstances you wouldn't need to remove this plate at all. We can see there's a lot of corrosion on the surfaces on the cassette player, so I think I might have some work to do there if this is salvageable. Working towards access on this cassette player, I removed this front rest. There are 4 screws, same kind as we saw before. 2 in this corner, 2 attached at this corner. When you're putting that back on, you would ensure that these surfaces are outside of these surfaces. The removal of 9 screws have allowed me to remove this plate here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 screws. Here's what the screws that I removed look like, though hopefully yours aren't as rusty as this. They're actually compatible with the domed cap ones that I've been removing earlier, as in they're the same length, same ferrule, but the top is slightly flatter. The removal of 4 screws from here, 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 and here allow me to remove this plastic plate that have the plastic buttons mounted in them. So if I tip from this end, pull up very slightly on this door mechanism because it's squeeze to get this part into that space. So you can see these are just plastic hinges and they're pushing down onto tactile switches on the circuit board below. These are the screws that I removed from that plastic plate. Very similar to the ones that I was removing from the bottom, the wrist rests and so on, but they're about 50% longer. They're about, I guess, 12mm long instead of just 8mm. The removal of 2 more screws, one from here and from a space in here, allows this plastic part to come off. So that's the power switch underneath the pot, which changes the pitch speed. The screws are the same sort of size as we had before, removing the plastic part here. Excuse the handheld footage for a moment. What I was about to shoot was just the removal of this plate that's over the mixer section, because I wanted to have a bit more leeway to get the transport out. So I've just tried to put this back to kind of talk you through what I just did. But look at all these little bits coming out. What there is little plastic parts around the edges of these square push-push switches, but it's such a tight fit that as I'm pushing them down, they're actually getting pushed out. So it might be better to take all of these out and then push them back over the switches once this is lined up. So I'm not going to try and put that back on just now, but anyway, that comes off. And it's 1, 2, 3 screws here, and 1, 2, 3 screws along this edge. It was very short flat head screws that were along there, and then equally short screws of the same type but with these domed heads that were in the positions along here. So you had 1, 2, 3 here, and 1, 2, 3 flat ones there. Those ones need to be flat because of the way those 2 plates go together. I'm feeling pretty daunted by the extent of the corrosion that I'm seeing on the metal casing here. I hope that doesn't bode too badly for the hopes of this refurbishment. You risk lifting up foam just now. I mean, that's falling to pieces. It hasn't actually rotted. You get foam rot where this stuff actually dissolves into sort of tarry-like substance. It's not quite there yet, but it's very, very brittle. I think really for that to be refurbished, we'd need to find a better solution than that. That's on the verge of turning into dust and getting into these faders. So not ideal way to demonstrate this. Basically, I've removed 1, 2, 3, 4 screws. And that's allowed me to lift the transport out, but the cables are so short that I had to detach them to be able to achieve that. So these 2, clearly part of how the logic speaks to the cassette player. So I've detached those. This cable that's still attached here is going to the pitch control. It's this cable here. I'll show you where that goes in a minute. And the reason that that's held there is just this cable tie. So once I cut that cable tie, I'll be able to pull this away and show you where these 2 are unplugged from. Before I show you where those plugs go in, let's take a minute to remark on this. I've never seen a transport this badly corroded. I can only turn this so far. Heads are still connected to the record and playback board. But look at that, that's the flywheel. You know, I've really only ever seen that kind of rust on a car that's been left to rot in a scrapyard before. And I mean, look at all this stuff. It's hard to see this being salvageable at this point, you know, wow. I can't completely remove this transport from the rest of the system without detaching the heads from the record and playback amplifier. I'm not quite sure how to access that, so I'm going to proceed to dismantle all of this until I can figure that out. Let's start by removing this board here. It's the maybe 1 centimetre long domed top screws that I've removed from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes. We also have LEDs with little plastic spacers here. The way they're coming out, the longer lead on the LED, which I believe is the cathode, is at the top. With those removed, this should lift off. I've missed a screw at the end. There's one just coming off to the side of the screen there. Same length as the others. That comes off now. From these 3 holes along the front here, I've removed these sort of flat screws. We saw 3 of them earlier along the top. Then I've removed 5 of the domed type, 1 from here, 2 from this corner, and 2 in holes just beyond this group of 6 jack sockets where I'm tapping. Removing those allows the mixer to be tipped up like this, with these 2 plastic parts acting as hinges. Now we can see where various wires are connecting to a board below here. It looks like this group of cables coming from the heads is going to join here, but I'm going to have to undo some cable tidies and cut some cable ties in order to establish which cable is which. I've cut a cable tie here, and I've removed another 1, 2, 3, 4 screws. You can see these are the holes for the 3rd and 4th screws. They were of the domed head, approximately 1 centimetre long type. So I can remove this plate. Probably you could get these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 headers associated with the magnetic heads open without removing that plate, but it's a little bit easier. I'm not completely clear here what the colouring scheme is. I can't see which is which track, but I would assume that maybe grey is the erase head and red is the record head for tracks 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4 in that order. Certainly we've got a cable that's grouping together all 3 of these signals, splits off into the 3 parts. They're not too stiff, I'm going to pull them out by hand. And that means the transport is completely separate. I can start looking at that in a bit more detail now. Backtracking here slightly, but just showing you where the cables from the transport are connected to these boards. So there are these 2 cables that are going to run from what will be the bottom left corner of the transport. And they'll be coming along underneath here and up to this board here. And it's the rightmost 2 out of these 3 here. You can see that I've actually used a Sharpie pen to colour one side of the header and the connector. That way I have some sort of visual clue about where that's going to go back. It's okay for me to use the same colour on both of these because the pin numbers are so different, there's no way I'm going to mix them up. I would like to be able to lift this board that has the transport control buttons and the counter display in it up so we can more clearly see the other headers into which the connectors from the transport are plugged. In order to do that, I've had to remove 1 more of these little dome head screws I missed out earlier in the centre here between these 2 LED displays. I'm also going to have to detach at least 1, 2, 3 more of these cables. So I've used another coloured Sharpie to colour in the header and the connector, make it more obvious when I'm plugging this back in where things go. The cables are strong, so I can just pull them in. The only other thing that seems to be preventing this board from lifting up is this cable here. There's a bit of leeway, but I'm going to lift this up and see if I can unplug it. Looks like it's coming into the 3rd up of a group of 4 headers along the right hand edge of this big board here. So colour that the same colour of marker pen before unplugging it. Put a little bit more ink on there so it's really clear where that's going. Now this will hinge back and forth and we can see what's under here a bit more clearly. Now that this lifts out of the way, you can see more clearly these 3 headers where stuff relating to this pitch control and the transporter are plugged in. The pitch control is coming down to this board on this 3-pin connector here. This one on the right, which has 4 pins. On the unit I'm looking at, that's kind of tidied up to the transport here with a cable tie, so there's not much leeway there, but we can unplug that like that. And then there's this longer, wider cable that's going into a board on the back of the transport. It's got 2 trimmers on it, so I guess those are the speed trim for 3 3/4 inches per second and 1 7/8 inches per second. So if I pull those up, the transport comes clear. What I'm going to do now is from an angle that way, which won't be easy to film, I'm going to take another colour of Sharpie, black in this case, and put black on the headers and connectors so that I know that these 3 cables are disconnected in one stage of deconstruction. So it's been about a week since the last bit of footage, and in that time I've sunk, I guess, upwards of 15, 16 hours refurbishing this transport because it was incredibly rusty. Most people who are going to take one of these apart aren't going to have one as rusty as that. So for this video, what I will do after I've shown it working is take it out again and show you how to do like basic stuff like access the pinch roller, the one belt that's in there, and the idler tire, rubber parts that you might need to clean or replace. For somebody like me who unfortunately has more work to do and needs to further deconstruct this very complex transport, I have kept a video diary while I've been refurbishing it, but the edited footage that I've got runs to something like 1 hour and a quarter, so I'll publish that separately for people who need to take a really deep dive. But anyway, this is it working. So here's the exposed eject button that pops up. It's the first unit I've worked on where you press a button to eject, and we have to put the wide end of the tape in that way, then you just push it down, and it is pretty much working. I mean, I haven't got it hooked up, but we seem to have playback from all 4 tracks. Stop's a little bit reluctant to work, so I'll probably replace that tactile switch, but you know, it fast forwards, oh no, I'm pressing memory, I'm not familiar with the layout, and then ejects again. Okay, so if I push that shut, ages ago I said I wasn't sure how this goes on. It just sort of slots on. There's little plastic clips here, so I'll just push that down, so that would sit like that in fact. Okay. Only other thing that I noticed here was initially I was getting some pretty weird behaviour from it, and that's because when I was colour coding these, they're actually the same length, so it's possible to get them mixed up, which I did. So what I'll do is I'll wipe the green ink off there, and once that's evaporated I'll put a different colour on that. So make sure you colour those 2 different colours so that you don't get those 2 cables mixed up. So a minimal refurbishment of a healthier transport than this one was to begin with, where we only have to replace the idler tire, the pinch roller and the control belt, or just clean them. It goes something like this. What you want to do is get this open and the head array partly raised so that we'll be able to access the pinch roller. So the first thing we want to do is turn this pulley in this direction so that we can raise the head a little bit and access the little C or E clip that's holding it in place. This is going to go by quite slowly, so in post-production I will speed up the footage. So I'd suggest raising it to about there, so it's not actually pushed up against the capstan yet, but it's raised up enough so that we can get at that E-clip there. And then if we push something sharp into the spaces on this little E-clip, we can just pull it off. Be careful because it might ping away and there's a washer underneath. Okay. So that's the clip off. Set that to one side. Get the washer off like that. Set that to one side as well. At that point we would be able to lift the pinch roller up, but the door mechanism's in the way, so what we're going to do is turn that pulley in the opposite direction, this way if you like, or anti-clockwise. There's an argument to say that you could probably just get the clip that way as well, and the whole thing's going to be easier, including accessing the idler tires in a minute. But anyway, there's just about enough space to get that idler tire off now. You could of course take off the entire door mechanism, but I think that's a lot harder. So you could clean that, replace it, whatever you're going to do. Moving on to the idler, we need to get this plastic plate off. These two locations where my fingers are little plastic clips. If I pull them back, tip up at this end, with a little bit of wiggling, that's going to come free. So now you can see the idler wheel here. We're going to remove the E-clip in a similar way. Again, careful it doesn't ping away, and there is a washer under there. Ha! So that did ping away. I'll need to find that in a second. And that's going to push up. See, the washer is still stuck to my fingernail. Fortunately, that hasn't fallen because there's a spring underneath that plate. You see that plate has two little recesses in it that correspond to these two white pegs when we put that back on. So we can lift the spring out, and then provided these protrusions on these two reels are in the right position, we can then lift that out of there. We can also see that there is a little space here that makes it easier to pry off the old tyre and put on a new one, or you could just clean that, treat it with something like MG Chemicals Rubber Renew is what I use. Putting that back on, we want the grooved side of the idler wheel to go down first. You need to give it a bit of a wiggle, pull down on this white mechanism because it's spring loaded, and then we insert spring into that space. Then this plate goes on top, and we need to push it down in such a way that the little holes line up with the white peg. Then we drop the washer on top. We place the E-clip beside the peg and use needle nose pliers to clip it into place, like so. See where the green tweezers are? We pull back on that, like so. That's going to raise the pinch roller arm slightly, and that's going to make it much easier to put that on there. So we could have done that to make it easier to take it off in the first place. Next we want to put the washer back on. The original E-clip just pinged away, and I've had to go off screen and get an equivalently sized one from a multi-pack. So don't let it happen to you. Try and approach this from a slightly different angle, see if I have better success. Right, that's better. I think it's just a matter of coming at it this way because I'm right-handed. If I push that up enough, I should be able to get needle nose pliers in there and clip it into place. Then, to get the plastic plate back in, first thing, these two recesses that I'm pointing out with my fingers, they need to go into slots in here by the pinch roller, and in here, just above and to the left of the erase head. And getting these protruding parts past the door mechanism isn't all that simple, but it's still simpler than completely removing the door mechanism. You'll see that when you see the long video where I completely take this apart. It's a real pain in the ass. Right, there, so I'm roughly in position. So I need that peg to go through that hole, but I also need that slot to go into that peg, and I also need this plate here to go behind this plastic protrusion here to the right of the capstan. Hopefully that's visible, the light's not that great. At that point, if I push down against these two clips, that'll go back flat, and this plate here should be not much higher than the part that the capstan pin is protruding from. I can now wind this pulley again until the door mechanism is shut again. And I want to do that because I'm going to turn this 180 degrees in a minute to get a bracket off so that we can change the control belt. Okay, so that's that shut. To get at the control belt, we're going to need to remove these two screws where my fingers are, and this one here. I'm usually using two sizes of a screw, and it's the smaller one that goes into these kind of screws. With those three screws removed, that's going to lift out like that. So This belt can be changed. I measured that earlier. It's approximately 70mm folded length. It's square section, and that's about 1.5mm thick. You could also take that off and lubricate that. I've already done it. So fit that belt over there. The teeth here are going to engage this white cam gear. We can only see a little of here beside my wiggly finger. So when you place that bracket back on, you also want to make sure that that's rotated so that the teeth engage properly. So that'll kind of go down into that space there. Make sure the bracket isn't tangled up with any of these other wires. And we don't want it to crush the cable that's going off to the switch here, so I'd probably pull that out of the way there. I would tighten them only part of the way, first of all, just to make sure that the intersection between those white plastic parts settles. You'll often find that if you tighten one all the way up, then the other holes don't line up, so you want to get all of them about halfway in before you start tightening anything too much. So with all of them in, I can tighten this one first. Maybe give that pulley a little bit of a wiggle back and forth to make sure the two white parts are intersecting with each other properly before tightening the other screws. And that's how you change or clean the rubber parts. The next thing I want to be able to do is deep clean these mixer channels and also faders and rotary pots that are on these boards, which have the master faders, switching for the different buses on it, etc. As you may be able to see, this one on the left is already loose. I've removed some shallow nuts and a couple of screws there, but to be able to get these off, first thing we want to do is take these boards, which are the buses. You can see bus A, bus B, and the power supply. We can see minus 10 volts, plus 10 volts, etc. And that's distributing the same power to all of these and shuttling the mixed information from these channels to the stereo bus, etc. You probably can't see very well from this angle, but there are pins protruding from these boards that are going into headers on the channels below. So we need to pry these out, and you need to go about this quite slowly because you don't want to bend it so much that we actually crack or damage the traces or the board beneath. I have in fact already done that, but just be very slow and gentle about it. So when I pull this one away, we can see that it's attached with two pins here. I'm going to colour them differently because they've got the same number of pins, and so it would be pretty easy to get them mixed up on reassembly. Having coated those, I can detach them, and this board is completely separate. Likewise, we would gently pry this away. And again, there are two cables going in there with the same number of pins, so we want to colour those differently from each other so that they don't get mixed up on reassembly. Having done that, we can then pull those out, and this board is separate. There are various other cables going into here, and in places they're held together with cable ties. So I probably want to replace those ties when I reassemble it, but I'm going to cut it for now. I'm just using scissors with a very sharp pointy end. You could probably use nail scissors or something. It allows me to cut this bit of plastic but not the cables beneath. Now, I haven't examined the schematic yet, so I'm not exactly sure what these red cables do, but the fact that they have an insulation containing a white and pink, if it's consistent with the Tascams that I've worked on, then those are some sort of signal cables, and these are probably tracks 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's note where the colours are. Blue is on the left, then yellow, then white, and then pink. I'm referring to the colour of the trim where the white and pink cables go inside the red insulation. So I can pull those out. We can also see that there are two boards here, and the lower one, as we look at it here, which would be the upper one if the mixer was closed, that has the sockets on it, and it's connected to the larger board above via cable. So we can pull out those connectors from those headers. I'll also do that for these three boards while I'm here. That should mean this upper board comes out now. And I'll close the mixer in a second and show you what I needed to disconnect from the upper surface in order to enable this to come out. The point being that I have access here. Get into these little holes in these rotary pots, get in the gap with these metal on metal surfaces, dislodge any dirt, I'll be using contact cleaner. I use Serviceol 10. There are alternatives. Blowing that through with compressed air, though in fact I use an adapted pump for a inflatable bed to do that, so I don't have to buy loads and loads of cans of compressed air. And depending how dirty it seems, I might repeat that part of the process several times, and then I follow up with Deoxit FL100. FL refers to the fact that it's ideal for plastic onto metal connections, which describes the way that most pots and faders work. You would use D100 for metal on metal connections, but we don't tend to see so many of those in Porta Studios and the like. That stuff lubricates it and would replace any grease that was removed by the contact cleaner during the earlier part of the cleaning. You do also get FL5, which is a spray can, and the 5 means that it's only 5% deoxit. The rest of it is contact cleaner, so once that evaporates, you're left with 5% of the deoxit. I find that that is quite an expensive way to do it, and although it's convenient, it's really only effective on machines that aren't all that dirty. If there's a big build-up of dirt or corrosion, oxidization, etc. inside one of these, then I find that it's much better to use an aggressive contact cleaner like Serviceol 10 a number of times and then follow up with the 100% deoxit. With this mixer, shut again, I'll show you which screws and nuts are removed in order to get this mixer board out. We do need to take this plastic cap off the top of this switch here. I'll move this up slightly. You can see that there are 2 screws, one at either end of each of the faders that need to be removed. Once removed, they look like that. These are the metal to metal screws with the rounded top, which have been the most common kind that we've removed throughout this build. We also need to remove 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nuts. You could do that needle nose pliers like so. I find it easier to use socket set. Here's a 12mm one. I'll loosen it off, and you can take the rest of it off just with your thumb and forefinger. I forgot to say there's also one more screw that needs to be removed when we take out these mixer boards. There's one just above the switch there. It's of the same type as we removed from either side of the fader. Now if we wanted to remove these, you're going to have one screw that's beside this RCA socket, and there's also a metal clip that slots into plastic recesses on these jack sockets. So we would take this out with a screwdriver and then use needle nose pliers, grip this, and pull it out. And that's what the clip looks like. You're not likely to get that mixed up with anything else, I don't think. So you can see I've gone ahead and removed these other 3 channels. They're all identical to each other, so it doesn't matter which order you put them back in. The 2 that I'm about to disconnect here are slightly different. The differences are here and here. There's no header here, whereas there is a header on these 2. And there is a header here where there isn't on these 2. I'll put those side by side once I remove them. But this is because these 2 daughter boards below relate to the XLR input and are different, larger than these 4. So if we unplug these, got 2 pin, a 3 pin. So we're not going to get those mixed up, I don't think. This one down here that connects to the XLR socket, it is also 3 pin, but it's so close to the XLR socket and it's labelled on the board as saying ground, cold, hot. That would be enough of a problem for me to know that that's where the XLR was going. If you want to be extra sure and colour code these connections with a marker before disconnecting them, then you go ahead and do that. And then this connector is the same as on the mixer channel boards that I've already removed. And just to confirm that here on this side, the way that you remove this is pretty much the same. You've got 1, 2, 3 screws per channel, same kind of screws, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nuts. One variety here, dull grey in colour, and then these kind of brassy coloured ones that are on the dual gang pots. With those 2 channels removed, let's just compare those 2 varieties of mixer channel that you're going to have. You're going to have 4 like this lower one and 2 like this higher one. There's this type where there's no connector here and there's no connector here, but there is one there. And then vice versa on this one, we've got these cables coming out that don't exist on this one, but there's no header wired into that socket, whereas there is a header there. Otherwise, these are identical. I say that with 95 to 99% confidence. I can't see any differences in the components or anything, and it would make sense they would build things in a modular way. But if, like me, you're taking this apart to clean it, it's just something to be aware of, that there's 4 like this and 2 like that. So make sure you've got them in the right slots when you put them back in. Otherwise you're going to be scratching your head about how to reconnect all this stuff. If you wished for some reason to remove these XLR sockets, or to remove the daughter boards below them by removing 2 little countersunk screws like that, you will be able to lift that out. And then in the case of the daughter board, there are no screws holding that up, it's just a pair of clips. They're similar to this kind that we removed already. They slot into plastic recesses that are on the jack sockets themselves. So if I take a pair of needle nose pliers and pull this one out, you can see that that board is going to drop down. I haven't mentioned yet, but all of these boards are connected by wires to something that's just on this lip of this part of the chassis. I will investigate that in due course. Before I disconnect these last 4 boards here, there is a certain amount of disentanglement I need to do here. We've got some cables that I've already color coded because they came from these little bus boards that I already removed. These ones were plugged into the first 4 mixer channels, but I need to see what I'm dealing with, so I'm going to cut this cable tie, which I'm probably going to need to replace when I rebuild this. So these go off to the side. These 2 cables, we can see from color coding, they're going down onto what looks to be the noise reduction board. So this white one's going down to the board below, this yellow one's actually attached to one of these daughter boards here. We're left with a clump of cables here. Okay, these seem to be breaking off into 2 groups, wired into the board below. You can't really see that. Yeah, so it looks like there's 3 there, the same size. And I reckon that's going to cause problems if we reconnect them in the wrong order. So before removing this first one, do some colouring in. I'm using green, you can use whatever colour you like. There's red dressing on these cables, and that's going down into noise reduction board. And behind that, okay, that one's wired in, and so that actually leads to the cables that were going to the first 4 channels. I assume that's probably like the direct record mode. This is the shortcut from the input to the record amplifiers, if you like, bypassing the mixer itself. So then behind here, there's another one that we can disconnect. So I'll want to colour that in. It's actually quite difficult to get at, so probably what I'll do is just colour in the very edge of it, and then colour in some more of it when it's taken out. So that's with a black dressing. So presumably that's how playback, that would make sense, right? Black dressing is playback, red dressing is record as it goes to and from the noise reduction. I'm speculating, but I think that's probably what all that stuff is. Okay, what else is running up in this group? Yellow one going to here. You see there are these 3 headers, so it's placed in between the 2 smaller ones about there. I don't see anything else the same size yet, so I'm not going to code that. This one with blue dressing, again we've got that red, blue, yellow, grey scheme, which I assume is how they're colour coding tracks 1, 2, 3, 4 of the tape. I'll want to colour that in, so go for blue there before unplugging that. Okay, and that's going down to the board below. This one here, there is a yellow 2-prong cable which is going down to, and I'll just tip the camera so you can see this position here. Why the heck not? I'll colour code it, it's going to make it that much easier for me when I come back. And then we've got a white one going over here, which is joining up to the second from the right. And I'll tip the camera again so you can see where that's it. It ends up about here. So I'll colour the end of that purple. purple plastic on the pen, it actually looks more like pink. At that point, there's nothing connecting these boards to boards in the lower half of the unit. Now let's look at cables that are running from the upper boards to the daughter boards. That just came out there. I'll colour that in black. Can probably afford to colour this cable that's coming from this one on the left to here in black as well, because it's a different pin number, so I won't get those mixed up. These wires are going down to board just off screen. I've already mentioned it, but we haven't looked at it. We will do. But I think otherwise this pair, it's all daughter boards, is disconnected. So what we're left with here is, yeah, 3 connectors on the left hand side of this little board here that I'm tapping with my finger. We've got red ones at the top, so maybe in that case what I'll do is leave a pink mark there and colour this pink, because it's got 3 pins and so does the one below, so I don't want to get them mixed up. And white one, and this one's only got 2 pins, so I think these are disconnected now. I can remove them from the chassis for cleaning. Looking at the removal of these, again there's pairs of these screws either side of the fader, and there are nuts around all of the pots, different style for the dual gang pots than for the single gang pots. Look, there's recesses here, so where my finger is, above and below this group of buttons, above and below this group of buttons, and above and below this group of buttons, there are screws there. Additionally, on this side of the board we have a couple of brackets, so there's screws here, here, and here. Those need to be removed as well. So here's the exposed appearance of all 4 of those boards as they would appear left to right on the mixer. So the leftmost one, there's no user controls on that whatsoever. Next over, 2 longish groups of push buttons. You notice that these plastic caps come off and this one doesn't want to stay on much at all. Then this one's got a small number of pots and buttons, and then the rightmost one, so this one also has 3 pots, 3 push buttons, and the rightmost one has the chunkiest of the faders, all pots and no buttons. Now that there's less stuff in this panel that had all the mixer things on it, I'm going to dare to remove the 2 plastic hinges. I've already got one out. Really what we do is we squeeze the white plastic. It may not be very visible, but the other one's right here, and if we squish those enough with needle nose pliers, then the plastic should compress enough to get through the slot. There we go. And let it go off eventually. These 2 slots here, these plastic parts on either side fit through them. So earlier I was saying that all of these daughter boards, these 4 with an orange cable, these 2 with a black cable, this one here is a blue cable, these 2 here red cables, and they're all soldered to a board here. It looks like via this common pad and then via the screw into the chassis. That's just a way for all of these to be connected to circuit ground. So if you needed to take these, do whatever it is, cleaning, soldering, to these boards, then I guess you would detach these, unscrew these 2 screws. The only ones that we haven't really looked at taking off are these ones and these ones, and you can see that there's a combination of the 2 kinds of metal clip that we used before being used to attach these. This one, it's a case of 2 screws. We've also got brackets here, one here and one here, and that's an attachment for one of the metal plates that we removed earlier. I think that is enough explanation so that if you did need access to any of this, you'd be able to figure it out based on what I've demonstrated so far.
At this point I'm trying to have a think about how much further I'm going to take this teardown. From my point of view, there doesn't seem to be that much wrong with the circuit boards. Now things like sockets, variable resistors like here, that'll be the pitch control. I probably do want to remove those. I also want to give you enough of an idea so you've got access for soldering and things like that. So I think I will show you how this pair of boards is connected around this corner by this series of ribbon cables. How that detaches, because although you could have that hanging off like that to solder, what if you needed to get at these boards? I think you would have to remove that. But with that off, and anything like this that might need to be cleaned, then I would say it's going to be easy enough to figure out how these things come out. I mean, if we're looking at this board here that will have the record and playback amplifiers on it, if the access that you have from underneath isn't enough for testing, soldering, this kind of thing, it's pretty obvious how this is detached. Like there's one screw here, one here, one here. So I mean, I think it's 3 down this side, so 6 screws out of the way, and then you'd be able to remove it completely. And assuming that you'd already got the mixer and everything off the top here, and anything to do with this board was unplugged, I think you'd probably have at most half a dozen other cables that would need to be disconnected to get this out. And using the methods I've already shown you, colour coding, taking photographs as you go along, you would be able to follow that should you need to. But I think the majority of people watching this, I guess they just want a sense of what it's like inside, which I would say is very complex. 644 and 688 are the two that I would say are equivalently complex. This is more complicated than a 246, 464, any of these more complex Fostex or Tascam units. This is definitely a more elaborate build. We'll come back if there are any electrical faults with any of this, and I will show you how I go about it, but presumably anyone who's going to troubleshoot a record and playback amplifier, somebody like that's going to have enough gumption and enough of a grounding in electronics that they can figure that out without me giving an absolutely step-by-step guide. So I think this is maybe as much as we're going to see of these two boards, other than me figuring out how to disconnect these two boards, which I'll go on to next. And yeah, apart from that, I probably want to clean this variable resistor for the speed, maybe I would want to get those headphone sockets off, but apart from that, I think we're quite near the end of the teardown. Did a little bit of figuring out off screen there, and so these are the steps that I've taken to get this detached. I've removed 2 zip tie cable ties. One was holding these cables here in a bunch, and another was holding these cables here in a bunch. I've also removed 2 screws. One was here where I'm tapping my finger, and the other was here. And they're of this same kind that we've seen a lot of, the domed cap, metal to metal, so thin ferrules close together at a shallow angle to the horizontal, if you like. There's a little cable here, I've coloured it blue, but whatever you like, and that's coming off and going down to the headphone socket that are just down off the edge of the screen there. On this side, I've coloured it pink. If I pull that out, we can see that's going through this recess here to the control boards and stuff under there. These 2 connections, this one here and this one here, second from the top, I already showed that earlier as part of the process of lifting this up so that we could get better access to the transport, so we'll disconnect them again now. There's a group of 4 connectors here, and so the bottom 2 of those are part of this clump. So colour those so you know where to put them back, and then that'll string it out through there. And that leaves us with 2 more groups, a yellow group and a white group, and they connect to this noise reduction board up here. So as you colour coordinate those, you can unplug those and string that out through there. And at that point, this is going to be detached. So if you needed to get in here to solder anything, recap stuff, clean these switches, which I will do, that gives you the access that you need. I've just got this little board that's got the power switch, the two variable resistors to calibrate the two speeds, 4.8 and 9.5 centimeter per second, 1 7/8 inches per second, and 3 3/4 inches per second, depending on whether you're using metric or imperial units. I do find it funny in a ha ha ha, somebody might die kind of way that they've put those things on the same board. The idea here is that if I reinsert this, if we take the panel off, then we can get in there and calibrate it, the speeds. And although there is this little brass protrusion here where I'm tapping with my finger, that's meant to stop a screwdriver from going off and touching the live wire coming from the AC mains. Yeah, seems kind of dangerous to me, but I mean, you should be using a ceramic screwdriver to adjust these, or plastic, or a plastic trimming tool, rather than a conductive screwdriver for that anyway. But without actually desoldering this from the mains input, then there isn't actually a way to get this separate. So I'm just going to have to clean that in situ. But anyway, there were two screws, these kind of screws that are all over this build, holding that power switch into place there, and then one nut was holding that up there on top, and there's a little cosmetic plastic bit that would slide on top of there. Just got access to this board with these two sockets on it. I guess that's what the punch in, punch out, and the headphone. That was slotting into space here. Another one of these clips that fits into black plastic recesses here, holds that flush, and another one of these screws that's common in this build is going through this pad here and connecting this circuit board to circuit ground. And I think that's really all you need to know. I mean, there's relays here, there's wires connecting. If you needed to get that little board off, it's this sort of standoff where you pinch the end with a pair of needle nose pliers, and that would allow this to come off those two plastic brackets there. I mean, there's a limited number of cables connecting things once you've got as much as I've shown taken off. So say you needed to get this board that's got control and power on it off, there's really only a couple of cables over here that it's connected to. Color code that, unplug it, you'd be fine. What else can we see here and comment on? Well, I mean, the transformers here are the voltage regulators. They are all attached to this big heatsink here. Don't think there's anything else too unusual that needs a great deal of explanation, other than, take photos. Maybe there's points here, these cable ties would need to be cut if you really needed to take one of these boards out. But actually, for a lot of soldering and testing, having taken the bottom plate off, and I showed right near the beginning how to take the central supporting plate off, you would have access to those boards, so it might not even be necessary to completely remove them if you did need to do some recapping or probing or whatever. I hope that was useful and interesting. Thank you for staying until the end. Remember that I have a Patreon where I go into a lot more detail with the repair side of things, as opposed to just the sort of tear down and belt changing side of things. It's pretty affordable, so please consider signing up for that if this is a kind of hobby that you're involved in regularly. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon.